Throughout the Second World War, Omar Bradley would rise from a relatively obscure training commander to lead the largest American field army ever assembled in combat. Unlike many of the war's celebrated generals, Bradley was not a man of theatrical gestures or personal flamboyance. He did not court the press, did not seek personal glory, and did not mistake audacity for recklessness. What he possessed instead was something rarer and in many ways more valuable: an exceptionally clear strategic mind, an instinctive feel for the human dimensions of warfare, and an ability to manage enormous complexity across vast frontages without losing sight of what actually mattered. His men called him the soldier's general. His enemies would come to understand why that reputation was fully earned. Bradley had spent much of the years before the war in relative obscurity, teaching at West Point and serving in staff roles that gave him no opportunity to distinguish himself in combat. But those years had sharpened his analytical faculties and his understanding of how large organizations actually function under pressure. When the United States entered the war, it was General George Marshall who recognized in Bradley the qualities that would be needed not merely to win battles, but to manage the vast, complex coalitions and armies that modern industrial warfare demanded. And it was in North Africa, in the spring of 1943, that Bradley was given his first real opportunity to demonstrate what he was capable of. By the time Bradley arrived in Tunisia in April 1943, the American Second Corps had suffered a grievous humiliation at the Kasserine Pass just weeks earlier. German forces under Rommel had torn through green American units with contemptuous ease, exposing serious deficiencies in training, leadership, and tactical coordination that had shaken confidence throughout the Allied command. The corps had been stabilized under General Patton, but Patton was being reassigned to plan the Sicily invasion, and Bradley was given command of the Second Corps with the task of rehabilitating its fighting effectiveness and contributing meaningfully to the final Allied push to clear the Axis from North Africa entirely. What Bradley inherited was an army that had been badly shaken but not broken, filled with soldiers who were learning their trade under fire in the harshest possible classroom. His approach to restoring their effectiveness was methodical rather than dramatic. He spent his first days visiting every division, every regiment, talking to officers and enlisted men alike, assessing not just the tactical situation but the psychological condition of his force. Where Patton had ruled Second Corps through iron discipline and rigid formality, Bradley deliberately took a different approach, relaxing the harshest dress code enforcement and working to rebuild the confidence of men who had been badly rattled. He relieved commanders he judged to be inadequate without hesitation, but without cruelty, and replaced them with men he believed could perform. When the final Allied offensive in Tunisia opened, Bradley directed the Second Corps with a precision and coordination that stood in marked contrast to the chaotic performance at Kasserine. His objective was to drive north and capture the port city of Bizerte, which would close the last escape route for the Axis forces and complete their encirclement. Bradley coordinated his 4 divisions with careful attention to the terrain, sequencing his attacks to prevent the enemy from concentrating against any single thrust, maintaining pressure across the entire frontage while directing his strongest forces at the points where the German defenses were most vulnerable. His corps pushed methodically through the mountainous terrain of northern Tunisia, coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery with a competence that American forces had not yet displayed in the field. On May 7, 1943, the 9th Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division entered Bizerte. On the same day, British forces took Tunis. Within days, over 230,000 Axis soldiers, the remnants of some of Germany's finest fighting formations, surrendered. The Axis position in North Africa had been completely eliminated. Second Corps had played a central and effective role in that final destruction, and the transformation Bradley had achieved in just a matter of weeks was recognized throughout the Allied command. He had taken a formation that had been publicly humiliated and turned it into a reliable, professional fighting force. It was not a glamorous achievement, But it was the kind of achievement that wins wars. The second demonstration of Bradley's operational art came more than a year later, in the summer of 1944, in the Bulge country of Normandy. By this point, Bradley commanded the 1st United States Army, responsible for the American sector of the Normandy beachhead. The invasion on June 6 had succeeded in establishing the lodgment, but by late July the Allied advance had slowed to a grinding, costly crawl through the hedgerow country that dominated the Norman landscape. The bocage, with its ancient earthen banks topped by dense vegetation, carved the countryside into thousands of small enclosed fields. Each one a natural fortress that had to be taken by frontal infantry assault. Progress was being measured in hundreds of yards at enormous cost in lives. The Germans were defending with skill and ferocity, and there was a genuine strategic concern that the campaign in France was losing its momentum. Bradley's response was Operation Cobra, conceived and planned almost entirely by Bradley himself. And it would prove to be one of the most consequential single operational decisions made by any American commander in the entire war. The fundamental concept was to use massive air power, on a scale that had never before been attempted in direct support of a ground offensive, to obliterate a narrow section of the German defensive line near the town of St. Lo. The bombardment would be concentrated on a rectangle of ground approximately 6 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep, saturating it with carpet bombing from hundreds of heavy bombers. If it worked, it would not merely suppress the German defenses, it would physically destroy them, blasting a gap through which armored forces could pour before the Germans could recover. The risks were substantial, and Bradley recognized them clearly. Heavy bombers were not precision instruments, and the margin between the German lines and the American forward positions was uncomfortably narrow. There was a genuine danger of short bombs falling on American troops, which in fact occurred on the opening day of the bombardment itself, July 25th. Killing and wounding hundreds of American soldiers, including General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. It was a personal blow to Bradley and a severe test of his resolve, but he did not waver. The cost of not breaking the stalemate, he judged, would far exceed the terrible price the bombing had extracted from his own men. On the 25th of July 1944, nearly 1,500 American aircraft dropped approximately 4,000 tons of bombs on the German defensive positions. The effect on the German lines was catastrophic. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force in a matter of hours. Its commander later described how the bombing had not merely killed men and destroyed equipment, but it shattered the psychological coherence of his entire command, leaving survivors so stunned and disoriented that organized resistance had become all but impossible. Bradley had planned the exploitation phase with equal care. 7th Corps under General Lawton Collins was positioned to drive through the gap the moment the bombing lifted. With armored formations given the lead and orders to drive south and then southwest, bypassing resistance, maintaining speed, and refusing to be drawn into the kind of positional fighting that had bogged the campaign down for weeks. The breakout worked with a speed that even its architects had not fully anticipated. Within days, American armored columns were racing through the open country south of the bocage, covering distances that would have taken weeks in the hedgerow fighting. By August, the entire German position in Normandy was unraveling. The breakout that Cobra had produced would lead directly to the encirclement battles of the Falaise Pocket and the liberation of Paris. Operation Cobra was the hinge on which the entire campaign in France turned, and the plan had been Bradley's from start to finish. But it was in the crisis of December 1944, when the entire architecture of Allied strategy in the West was suddenly and violently thrown into question, that Bradley's most important contribution to the outcome of the war would be made. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, the very same terrain that had been considered impassable in 1940 and which Allied intelligence had once again underestimated. The attack struck the weakest sector of the American line with overwhelming force, driving enormous penetrations through shocked and outnumbered American units. It was the largest German offensive in the West since the fall of France, and in its opening days, it created a crisis of confidence throughout the Allied High Command. Bradley was commanding the 12th Army Group at this point, eventually comprising over 1.3 million men, the largest American ground command in history. When the Bulge tore through his lines, the immediate operational problem was one of staggering complexity. The penetration had driven a salient deep into the American front, cutting off some units, threatening to split the Allied line, and creating a fluid, fast-moving battle across hundreds of kilometers of winter terrain in the worst weather conditions Europe had seen in years. There was enormous pressure, both from within the Allied command and from political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, to respond with panic and improvisation. Bradley refused to panic. His most consequential single decision in the battle came almost immediately. Recognizing that the northern shoulder of the German penetration had to be held at all costs to prevent the enemy from breaking through to the Meuse River and potentially reaching Antwerp, Bradley directed available reserves northward with cold deliberation, committing the 7th Armored Division to St. Vith and critically releasing the 18th Airborne Corps, which in turn committed the 101st Airborne Division to hold the vital road junction at Bastogne. These decisions, made in the opening hours of the crisis before the full scale of the attack was even understood, were the pivotal acts that defined the outcome of the entire battle. St. Vith held for 6 days against repeated German assaults, costing the enemy irreplaceable time in an offensive that depended entirely on speed to reach its objectives before Allied reserves could respond. Bastogne held completely, even after being entirely surrounded, its famous defiance becoming one of the enduring symbols of American arms in the entire war. But that defiance was only possible because the right forces had been sent there in the first hours of the crisis, before the roads were cut, on judgment and nerve, rather than waiting for clarity that the fog of battle would not provide. When Field Marshal Montgomery, who had been given temporary command of the northern flank of the salient, suggested at a January 1945 press conference that British forces had essentially rescued the Americans from disaster, it was Bradley who pushed back with quiet firmness, making clear to Eisenhower that such a characterization was not only historically inaccurate, but damaging to the fighting spirit of every American soldier under his command. It was one of the few moments when Bradley's customary restraint gave way to something harder, and it was entirely justified. The Battle of the Bulge had been turned not by a single dramatic counterstroke, but by the immediate, correct decisions made in the opening hours of the crisis. Those decisions had been Bradley's. By May 1945, the 12th Army Group had driven deep into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine, encircling the Ruhr industrial region and capturing over 300,000 German troops, and linking up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River. The war in Europe was over. And the general who had never sought the spotlight, who had let his campaign speak where other commanders gave speeches, had led more American soldiers in combat than any officer in the history of the United States Army. Thank you for watching. Which of Bradley's 3 operations do you find most impressive, and which commander should we cover next? And if you enjoy the content, do consider subscribing.